There comes a moment in this journey where something subtle yet incredibly powerful begins to happen, and most people completely miss it. It's the moment when the noise stops. No messages, no checking in, no emotional reactions, no chasing, just silence. And in that silence, the entire dynamic begins to shift. You see, what once felt like connection was often built on attention, reaction, and emotional exchange. The narcissist thrives on that cycle. They depend on it more than they would ever admit. Every response you gave, every moment you tried to explain yourself, every time you reacted emotionally, you were feeding a system that kept them in control. But now, something is different. You are no longer participating. At first, it may feel uncomfortable. You might wonder if they've forgotten you or if the silence means you've lost. But that's only because you've been conditioned to associate silence with absence, when in reality, silence is where your power returns. When you stop reaching out, you are no longer placing them at the center of your world. You are no longer seeking validation, answers, or closure from someone who was never truly providing it. And in that moment, whether you realize it or not, the balance begins to tilt. Because now, the one who was always certain of your presence is faced with your absence. And that changes everything. The silence you hold is not empty, it is filled with self-respect, with restraint, with awareness. It is a decision not to engage in what once drained you. And the more you remain in that space, the more you detach from the need to be seen by them, understood by them, or chosen by them, or chosen by them. Meanwhile, on the other side, something unfamiliar begins to stir. Without your reactions, without your energy, without your attention, the narcissist is left without their usual sense of control. And control to them is everything. This is the shift. Not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. Because the moment you stop feeding the dynamic is the moment you stop being controlled by it. And in that silence, you don't lose them, you find yourself. And as that silence continues, something begins to unfold on the other side, something they are not prepared for. What you must understand is that the connection was never sustained by love in the way you believed it was sustained by supply. Your attention, your reactions, your emotional presence, these were the very things that kept them regulated. And now, without it, they begin to experience a kind of internal disruption. It may not look obvious from the outside. They may still appear composed, distracted, or even unaffected. But internally, there is a growing sense of imbalance. The absence of your energy creates a void they cannot easily fill, because what you provided was specific, it was familiar, it was consistent, and now it is gone. This is where withdrawal begins, not in the dramatic sense, but in a subtle psychological way. There is restlessness, a need to check, to know, to feel in control again. They may start to think about you more than they expected. They may replay past interactions, not out of nostalgia, but out of a need to understand why the dynamic has changed. Because in their experience, you were predictable. You responded. You engaged. You stayed. And now you don't. This lack of access creates tension. It disrupts their sense of certainty. And without certainty, they cannot operate in the same way. They may try to distract themselves, seek attention elsewhere, or convince themselves that it doesn't matter, but the shift has already taken place. What once felt stable to them now feels uncertain. And uncertainty is uncomfortable for someone who relies on control. So the mind begins to search for resolution, not necessarily for connection, but for restoration of power. They may wonder if you will return, if you are thinking of them, if you are still affected. Because if you are not, then something has changed beyond their reach, and that is what unsettles them the most. Not your absence alone, but the possibility that your absence means independence. Because independence removes influence, and without influence, their position weakens. This is why the silence you hold is doing more than you think. It is not just distance, it is disruption. It interrupts the pattern they depended on. It removes the emotional feedback they relied on to feel in control. And as this continues, they are left to sit with something unfamiliar, the lack of access to you, and the loss of the role they once played in your world. And in that space, they are no longer in control of the connection. And while all of this is unfolding on their side, Something even more important is happening within you, something far more lasting than any reaction they could ever have. As the silence continues, your energy begins to reset. At first, you may not notice it. There can still be moments of doubt. Pe er e ve yeru che en yeru ye em yeru sle. The urge to check, to reach out, to break the silence just to feel something familiar again. But if you remain still, if you allow the space to exist without interfering, a quiet transformation begins to take place. Because for so long, your thoughts, your emotions, your focus, they were entangled in a cycle that kept pulling you outward. You were reacting, adjusting, questioning, overthinking. Your energy was constantly being directed toward them, whether through presence or absence, pain or hope. But now, without that constant exchange, your energy has nowhere to go but back to you. And this is where clarity begins. You start to notice how much of yourself you had been giving away, how much mental space was occupied, how much emotional weight you were carrying. And as the days pass without contact, that weight begins to lift. Not all at once, but gradually, gently. Your thoughts slow down. The urgency fades. The need to understand every detail begins to dissolve. You are no longer trying to make sense of something that was never meant to be understood from a place of imbalance. Instead, you begin to reconnect with something deeper, your own sense of self. You remember what it feels like to exist without tension, to wake up without that immediate pull toward them, to move through your day without constantly anticipating or analyzing their behavior. This is not just healing, it is restoration. Your emotional state becomes more stable. Your mind becomes clearer. And most importantly, your sense of worth begins to rebuild, not based on how they treated you, but on how you now choose to treat yourself. You begin to realize that your value was never dependent on their attention. It was only ever hidden beneath the noise. And now, in the quiet, it is returning. This is why the silence is so powerful, not because it affects them, but because it transforms you. It gives you the space to reclaim your energy, to redirect your focus, and to rebuild from within rather than react from without. And as this reset continues, something shifts in your awareness. You are no longer waiting. You are no longer hoping. You are simply becoming. And in that becoming, you are no longer the same person who once needed their presence to feel whole. And as you continue to move in this quiet strength, something else begins to unfold, often unseen, yet very real. Even in the absence of contact, the connection does not simply disappear from their awareness. In many cases, it shifts form. What was once direct becomes distant. What was once spoken becomes observed. They begin to watch, not always in obvious ways, not always with clear intention, but there is a pull, a curiosity that lingers, because your silence has created a question they cannot easily answer. You are no longer expressing, no longer reacting, no longer revealing where you stand. And to someone who once relied on your emotional transparency, this lack of visibility becomes compelling. They may check your presence in subtle ways through social spaces, mutual circles, or quiet observation. Not necessarily to reconnect, but to assess, to understand whether you are still within their reach or if you have truly moved beyond it. Because what unsettles them is not just your absence, but your unpredictability. You are no longer playing the role they understood. You are no longer responding in ways they can anticipate. And without that predictability, they cannot position themselves in the same way as before. So they watch, they look for signs, for movement, for evidence that you are still affected, still available, still emotionally tied. Because if you are, then the door remains open. But if you are not, if you have become still, grounded, and self-contained, then something has shifted beyond their control. And this is where your awareness becomes essential, because this phase can be deceptive. You may sense their attention again. You may notice subtle indications that they are still aware of you, and part of you may feel drawn to respond, to acknowledge, to re-engage, even in the smallest way. But understand this: observation is not transformation. Their watching does not mean they have changed. It does not mean they now see you differently in a way that leads to something healthy. It simply means they are trying to understand a dynamic that no longer behaves as it once did. And if you break your stillness too soon, the the cycle can quietly begin again. This is why your silence must remain intentional, not as a reaction to them, but as a commitment to yourself. You are no longer performing, no longer explaining, no longer seeking to be seen through their eyes. You are simply being. And in that state, their observation loses its influence, because you are no longer affected by whether they are watching or not. You have stepped out of the need to be perceived and into the power of self-possession. And when you are no longer seeking their attention, even their silent attention can no longer reach you. And as you remain in this space, no longer reacting, no longer reaching, no longer needing to understand them, something begins to clear within you. Not all at once, but in quiet realizations that arrive without force. The illusion you once held starts to loosen its grip. What once felt confusing begins to make sense, not because they have explained anything, but because you are no longer inside the emotional storm that kept everything distorted. Distance has given you perspective, and with that perspective, you begin to see what was always there, but hidden beneath attachment. You start to recognize the patterns. The inconsistency that once felt like mystery now reveals itself as instability. The intensity that once felt like connection now appears as control. The moments you held onto as proof of something real begin to feel different when viewed without emotional dependence. This is not about blaming them or labeling every interaction. It is about seeing clearly. You begin to remember how often you questioned yourself. How often did you adjust your behavior to maintain peace? How often you ignored what you felt just to keep the connection intact? And now, with space between you and the experience, those moments no longer feel normal. They feel revealing. Because what you once interpreted as love was often tied to uncertainty. It kept you thinking, analyzing, hoping. It kept you engaged, but not at ease. And now, as your energy stabilizes, you begin to understand that real connection does not require that level of emotional strain. This is where the illusion breaks, not in anger, not in bitterness, but in awareness. You no longer see them through the lens of who you hoped they were. You begin to see them as they are, and more importantly, you begin to see yourself as you were within that dynamic. And that recognition brings a quiet kind of truth, one that doesn't need validation, because it feels undeniable. You may even find yourself asking why you tolerated certain things, why you stayed as long as you did. But even that question begins to soften, because you understand that you were responding from where you were at the time, and now you are somewhere else. You are no longer trying to fix, to prove, or to hold on to something that required you to lose yourself. You are no longer attached to the version of the story that once kept you emotionally invested. You are simply seeing. And in that seeing, there is release, because once the illusion fades, it cannot be rebuilt in the same way. The clarity you gain replaces the confusion you once lived in. And from that clarity, your decisions begin to change, not out of force, but out of understanding. You no longer need to convince yourself of anything. You just know. And then, almost without noticing the exact moment it happened, you arrive at a place that once felt impossible. Not dramatic, not loud, not marked by some grand realization, but steady, shut, and real. You stop needing them. It doesn't come from forcing yourself to move on. It doesn't come from pretending you no longer care. It comes from everything that has quietly shifted within you along the way. The silence you held, the energy you reclaimed, the clarity you gained, all of it begins to settle into a new state of being. Where they once occupied your thoughts, there is now space. Where there was urgency, there is calm. Where there was emotional dependence, there is stability. And in that space, something changes at the core of you. You no longer look for them in your day. You no longer wonder what they are doing, what they are thinking, or whether they will return. Those questions simply lose their importance. Not because you have all the answers, but because you no longer need them. This is the shift most people don't expect. They think the goal is to get a reaction, to make the other person realize your value, to have them come back and finally understand. But what truly happens if you remain in this process is far more powerful than that. You outgrow the need for their recognition entirely. And when that happens, even if they were to return, even if they were to reach out or attempt to reconnect, it no longer holds the same weight. Because the version of you that once needed that moment no longer exists. You have changed. Your sense of self is no longer tied to their presence or absence. Your emotional state is no longer dependent on their behavior. You are no longer waiting to be chosen, because you have already chosen yourself. And that decision, quiet as it may be, is what transforms everything. There is no longer a pull to go back, no longer a desire to revisit what once kept you stuck. Not out of resistance, but out of understanding. You see clearly now what it cost you. And more importantly, you see what you have gained by letting it go. Peace, clarity, freedom. And these are not things you are willing to trade again. This is the outcome that truly shocks people, not that the other person changes, but that you do. That you reach a point where their absence no longer feels like loss, but like alignment. Because you are no longer trying to complete yourself through someone who never held that role. You are already whole. And from that wholeness, there is nothing left to chase.